everyone, welcome to Manufacturing Hub. We are back on our normal day and time, Wednesday afternoon. This is super exciting this week. We've had two manufacturing hubs, and if you guys are confused how we're doing two manufacturing hubs in a week, believe you me, this is the second Wednesday I've had so far 3 days into the week, which is generally a good thing. Super excited to have Jane on as we continue our IIoT conversation. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you guys have been here before, welcome back. If you're new here, we love to have open, fun conversations. This month, we're talking all about IIoT, and one of our favorite things is to hear and read the chat and everything that you guys are saying during this. If you've got questions for Jane or Vlad or myself, please feel free to go ahead and drop them in the chat. The main places that most people are watching us are on LinkedIn as well as YouTube. Assuming that the connection gods are still working, we will see them and be able to go ahead and drive them into the conversation with Jane. If you guys ask super technical questions, which honestly is very probable given Jane's background on connectivity and all of the awesome things she's doing right now, we might not be able to get to all of those, and so we will do our very best to go tag them and come back later on. But without further ado, everyone, officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. My name is Dave. This guy up here is Vlad. We're on episode 167 talking all about IIoT with Jane Arnold. Jane, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Dave, for the invitation, and I enjoy talking to you and Vlad today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane. Really appreciate your time. Before we dive into maybe the more technical or more industry related discussion, could you give us a little bit of your background? Ultimately, how did you get into manufacturing and what are you doing today?
Okay, well, I have to go back. I'll have to say to last century because in the late '80s, I was in college and I took a summer job. So my plan was not to be an engineer because my father was, and so I took a summer job and I was learning. I was doing instrument electrical drafting on AutoCAD. So this was '88, I think, and so one of the earlier versions of AutoCAD, and learning all about instrument electrical drawings and had a great mentor in the field showing me around and showing me everything. And that was like a super interesting summer, and I didn't realize how much I really liked engineering and how much I liked manufacturing. So my summer job turned into 16 years at Sterling Chemicals, which is a small chemical plant in Tech City, Texas. It's no longer there. It's changed hands a few times. It's called Eastman now, or maybe Ineos, I think is what it is. Anyway, I was there. Did a lot of panel board to DCS migration projects and safety instrumented systems. And then after we installed all of the control systems around the site, and including a Pi data historian, it's like, well, okay, we spent all this money. What else can we do? So I started learning the process and working on process control algorithms. And what was really interesting is that they let me, at my request, work with operators. So I went through operator training, and I joined operators on all of their technical training with equipment and how things are supposed to work. And then I worked with chemical engineers on what's actually happening in the pipe and on that to understand that, and then looking at the data and the cause and effect relationships between that data. And then by circumstance, I worked for 4 months as a board operator and working 12-hour shifts due to circumstances outside of my control, but it was the best experience I had, and it shaped the way I approached everything in the future, because I realized that no matter how smart I am or how smart the engineers are or anybody else, the person who knows the most is that person with their hands closest to the process, and they have this nuance understanding of how the process is supposed to run. So I sat there for 4 months, 12 hours days on the board, and I was fixing all the stuff that I had installed in the prior decade. And it's like I really learned. So from then on, I always included operators. Well, why do you do that? Why do you do this? What's happening here? And I took that all the way through my career. So I left Sterling Chemicals in 2005 and joined Bayer MaterialScience, which later became Covestro, and just wanting to do my thing, which was advanced process control and system support. And they encouraged me to take a leadership position, so I was head of automation for Baytown. And then for development, they put me in a unit. They said, okay, well, you work so closely with operations, you know this process, you've written all the controls. So everything runs on controls. So we're going to make you the unit lead. And that led me to be the production train lead, which they called plant manager at Covestro. And that was by far the best job I ever had, because I had maintenance and operations and engineering, and there was always something every day that needed attention. I had 4 operating units, and it was really super fun. As an opportunity, they asked me if I wanted to go to Germany as the senior vice president of global process control technology. And to be honest, I didn't think I'd get it, so I said yes, I want to be considered. And 6 months later, I'm in Germany. And the board gave me the edict to implement Industry 4.0. And so I had to understand really fully what that was, but I had a fabulous team, and they had a lot of great ideas and things they've been looking at. And so we looked at our tech stack, starting with the data historian, and what all is missing. We've got great dynamic simulators, a lot of data. Can we use machine learning models and AI in order to help do things? So we built what's now called the Covestro monitoring platform at Covestro. And so it's really interesting, because at a glance, the user can understand what's happening with that asset. So we've got links into Seek, into the drawings, into the data historian, into the maintenance system, and looking also at the health of the transmitters to make sure that everything going into those algorithms are actually good. And so that was super interesting. But pandemic happened, and I left Germany at the beginning in March of 2020, and decided that I wanted to try something different. So I spent a year resigning, and then handing everything over, and then I changed to Stanley Black and Decker, and I got to understand how does the discrete and additive world work based on 32 years of chemical processing. And I learned that everyone has the same problems. They're just making different stuff in different methods, but there's still a data problem, there's still a connectivity problem, there's still a human adoption problem, and getting people to buy into actually using the technology. And so we built a plan at Stanley as to how can we make improvements, and we ended up choosing Tulip as a way, because they didn't have data, so they didn't really have a starting place. There were some Linehouse, there was some good stuff, but most of the sites, they didn't actually store the data on a data historian. So we had to step back a step. And Tulip really helped bridge that gap at Stanley Black & Decker. And then I had an opportunity to retire, and I decided that I was, just going to hang out. And I was already new Aperio, and I'd become an advisor and a member of the board a few years prior. And Jonas Helgren kept asking me to join. I'm like, no, I don't want to actually work, right? It's a few hours here and there is fine, but I don't want to actually work. And then he's like, come on, join some customer calls. So I joined a couple of customer calls, and they'd open up the hub, which is called DataWise, and they'd show in a use case, hey, I'm looking at all my environmental critical tags. Look, you can tell right away if something is flatlined, there's a sensor problem. And I was immediately hooked. I was like, when I was a unit engineer for 20 years, if I'd have had something like this, I wouldn't have spent 80% of my week trying to figure out what was wrong, because then I would have a great tool to eliminate a lot of the possibilities. And so anyway, he convinced me to join. And so I joined Aperio in March, and I am head of customer success. And I have a great team of customer success managers who all have field experience in various fields.
Jane, I've got a ton of, I guess, follow ups, and I think we can take this in many different directions, right? But let me maybe chronologically take a step back. When you went to Germany, I think that was quite an experience, first
Yeah.
of all, but also, I'm curious on how that went from, obviously different regions do things slightly differently. You also had to figure out, I guess, the industry 4.0 architecture and the data, I guess, a collection, which again involves a lot of details. So I'm curious, as someone who hasn't gone through such a big transition, what did that really entail? how was the experience, and ultimately maybe some learning points for someone who is looking at such opportunities in their career and or company?
So what I have to say is, as far as I was with the same company, so moving from Texas to Germany, which from a culture standpoint is quite different. I did have the HR guy tell me when I accepted the position that I cannot bring my guns to Germany, and I'm like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean guns?" He goes, "Well, you're from Texas. Of course you have guns." And so, and I was like, "Well, okay, I'll leave my gun here, right?" So there was definitely a cultural difference. But one of the things that Bayer did, and that Covestro did, was they really shared best practices and resources. So we did have individual sites in different regions, but we took the best of what we had and we copied it. So, for example, I worked in an MDI plant, and I think it was maybe the third one or maybe the fourth one. But so they build an MDI plant, which is hard foam polyurethane, and then they would perfect it with all the controls and dynamic simulator and things like that, and what are all the problems. And they would look at the data for a bottlenecking, debottlenecking project, and then they would build the next plant somewhere else with slight improvement. So we could easily cut and paste our solutions. So with the Covestro monitoring platform that we developed, and with Pi, and then using asset framework, since we had standard tag naming convention and most of the equipment around the world in the different product lines were the same or very similar, it was a lot easier to do that replication. And but from a cultural standpoint, it was tough, but the company has very strong best practices and procedures, and making sure that we're sharing those wins. So there would be like technical groups for all the different production lines that they would meet regularly, like every quarter, to discuss, hey, what's going on in MDI or TDI. And there would be technical groups, same sort of thing, in PCTs, so process control technology, or the electrical field, and all that. So we always shared that information, and I think that really made a difference. So it wasn't completely going from a new, from one place to another, a complete change. Just the culture was a bit of a shock.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? I think a lot of companies. So I went through Procter and Gamble, and they had similar opportunities. Like as you rise through the ranks, you almost were obliged to take I guess an expat assignment to
Yes,
get to a certain level.
yes.
I personally didn't get there, right? But there was an opportunity that was being kind of discussed and presented over the years. So I think it's very interesting that you definitely made that jump.
Well, I had a great experience, and in total, I was in that role for maybe 4.5 years, maybe 5. 4 of them I was physically in Germany, but I traveled 50% of the time. So I was in Asia, I was in Europe, I was in the US. It didn't matter. And occasionally something would happen where I had to be the first responder, because it was like a something that got people nervous. So I'm like, okay, I'll go, I'll take a look, and we'll calm everybody down and go and do that. And so I took a few last minute trips, and I just marveled at the fact that I'm at this level, and I'm a P1 responder. So yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you, I guess, as a follow-up, you made then the transition to Black& and Decker, which you've mentioned was a more, I guess, like discrete slash additive type of manufacturing. And you said it's,
Yes.
I guess, in a sense similar, but also a little bit different. So I'm curious, maybe your thoughts on, the different verticals. How was your experience transferring? Because I think a lot of times we hear that if you have very deep knowledge in a certain industry, it's very difficult, to move into something else. Maybe what were your thoughts and some learning points
I
doing
think
that?
I think one thing that makes me different is that I don't actually have an engineering degree. My degree's in mathematics, and I finished my degree while I was working, and so I have a different perspective. Instead of having hardcore education all the way through the end through a PhD, and then having your mindset on just those topics, then I had this whole open world that I kind of got to. I had a lot of great opportunities to try new things because I was interested. Um, but the I forgot your question. So now that we're live, right,
Yeah.
we can't edit that. So what is your question?
The question is going to Black& and Decker, right? So
Yes,
switching industries in a fairly I don't
yes.
wanna say drastic because I don't know how it actually, like, took place, but what was your experience going to a completely different industry from chemicals to Black and Decker, which is more, I guess, discrete manufacturing? I'm
Right.
assuming.
So apologies for that. So when I accepted that position, I thought, oh, this will be fun, right? I'll go do this. And they wanted me to be over Industry 4.0 for manufacturing. And those first couple weeks before I actually joined, I was like, what have I done, right? I've resigned from one job. I'm starting another one. What have I done? And so the first week I drove to Dallas Fort Worth and visited the factories that we have there that Stanley had in that area, and met with plant manager and walked through and looked at what are their problems. I was like, oh, it's all the same. We're making stuff. We have machines that make things. We're collecting data on some of it. We're trying to respond to that data. Lots of people doing different things. It's all the same. It's good. So the underlying principles are good. And along that thread, I was part of the World Economic Forum for 3 years, so 2 with Covestro and 1 with Stanley, and I was on the advanced manufacturing team in data excellence. And we had representatives across all the manufacturing verticals that were talking about this. And what was so interesting is that, it doesn't matter if you're automotive or you're aerospace or chemicals, oil and gas, power, they all had the same problems. So there was a white paper published on it, but it was really freeing to know that we're all struggling through the same thing. So how can we share that information, that knowledge, and help the whole world kind of come up a level? And so that was really interesting. So yes, the training might be different and the focus might be different, but when you step back and look at technology and the human aspect of technology, frontline workers and people responding to maintenance, it's all the same.
I have a dozen more questions, but Dave, I do want to let you jump in as well.
Thank you, Vlad. I commend you. I realized I just saw your eyes light up. For all of our podcast listeners, every once in a while, Vlad's eyes light up, and I'm like, I may not get to say another word during the entire show. So thank you for that. Jane, this has been really interesting. The background. I love your comments of at some point everyone has problems, and everyone's problems are very similar.
Yes.
Now, for everyone, I met Jane during what she briefly calls her retirement, and so I am super excited to go dig into what she's doing with Apperia and what got her to come out of retirement into working with this new team. But before we go talk about what they're doing, I want to talk more of the base of IIoT. So, Jane, can you tell us a little bit more of the benefits of what IIoT is, and maybe if you have a definition, the definition or delineation between IIoT and Industry 4.0, which is a regular topic of argument between Vlad and I.
Okay, well, I'm probably not going to solve your argument problem because I have a feeling that there's a lot more behind that. Um, but when I look at the benefits of IIoT, so I spent 30 years in continuous processes and everything was wired up. And we even tried to, before I became the head of the department, we tried to implement, Wi-Fi in the unit. And then heart-based Wi-Fi, meaning that it's still on level 1 and we're not going to the cloud. It's sending the signal in, and it was always no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And I tell people, well, so therefore I had to become the head of department in order for us to implement it. But it's very expensive, especially to do the Wi-Fi and the heart Wi-Fi and actually wire it into your DCS. And then, you're using points on the DCS to get that data to the operator. And then you're putting in the data historian. So you're using points there. And then now, a lot of companies are duplicating that data in the cloud. And so you're taking that space there. Mm-hmm. What I found with IIoT when I started looking at it, it was all those places that we had like operator rounds, remote assets, second tier or something like that, non-critical assets. We didn't want to wire it up, but we wanted the information. So we'd send, we might install cameras or we send someone around. Well, now there's all kinds of sensors available, and you can install sensors on valve positions, on, vibration of a device. You've got transmitters for temperature, pressure, whatever, that are all remote that you can just clamp on and send it over, LoRaWAN or cellular connection or whatever is available. And easily get to that data so you can have insights for it. And so it's all the things that you can do with the wired data and with time series data, you can do with IoT. So all of the predictive maintenance, all of the control. I'm still not to the point where I would do control with IoT, but it is possible. But say something easy, like I was talking with someone about, having heat in a greenhouse, and
Hmm.
you don't want to have it on very often, but once in a while you get a cold snap and you want it to come on automatically. Well, that's IoT and control in that environment, and that's really what it is. It's a lot cheaper. And the batteries today, that used to be something that hold people back. The batteries last much longer. They last for years.
Hmm.
And so you can easily have a continuous process if you wanted it.
I think that's really interesting. I know Vlad's going to jump in, but I want to go ask the question talking about IoT, Jane. So when you look at it as, I guess, when you're looking at it, do you think of IIoT more like groups who are buying wireless solutions and kind of going and driving it to their own cloud solutions and they own from sensor to cloud, or are you more interested in groups kind of offering IIoT as a service? I feel like there are a number of interesting plays there, and I'd love to get your thoughts and opinions on those, please.
I mean, I think it really depends on how mature your company is. So
Mhm,
at Stanley, we had some IIoT as a service for vibration monitoring, which
mhm,
worked well. But again, we didn't have the infrastructure to wire up anything or to store that data or anything like that. So that was really what was needed. Um, with Imperio, we have several customers, many customers that are using IIoT. And they are picking and choosing what devices that they want. And they have teams that actually manage the hubs and manage that transfer of data and make sure your signal strength is good. And they're deciding, there's long discussions about, well, what's going to be our source of truth? Is that going to be the
mhm,
Pi data historian or whatever data historian it is, or is it now going to be ADX or Snowflake or whatever, wherever
mhm.
you're storing your data, which is the source of truth. And it's interesting how that's changed over the years as technology has improved.
If I can ask Jane, like on that same point of, I guess, integrating and pulling that data, and I think we have a point again midway in the conversation, but just to weave that in, maybe the challenges that people are experiencing in getting the right data, right? And to maybe preface that a bit with my experience, I know that there's a lot of, how to say, it's very difficult to get contextualized data, right? What I mean by that is, I think you can come in and there's an integrator who put in, let's say, a historian or a database or even Pi, but it becomes, how to say it, almost an exercise in trying to get the data and understand what that data represents. And that's where a lot of the time is spent. So I find that is almost an unsolved problem yet in the manufacturing space. So I'm curious maybe what kind of challenges you see some of your customers like discussing when it comes to getting data.
So everything moves really slow in manufacturing when they're doing something new. So there's always a trial period, a year or 2 years or something, where they're trying things out. And but I've seen some customers that once they make the decision, yes, we're doing this. Like one customer went from, we talked 6 months ago. They were up to 1,000 IoT points, and they're aggregating all the information and doing actionable insights and all that. And they said, "Oh, we're going to expand." And I touched base with them, last week, and it's like, "Oh, we're up at 4,000, and we're doing
Mhm.
everything that's non-critical that has something that we need to know about." We're putting an IoT sensor on it, and because it is so easy to do, to install, even though there's not standards, which I'm sure we'll touch on. It's inexpensive. It might cost you what, $1,000 to install a sensor and start
Yeah,
collecting data on it at the most, and it could be a lot
yeah.
lower than that, depending on if you've got some sort of communication device. In order to do it. But when you look at the same installation that's hardwired, it might be $20,000 at the end of the day
Mhm.
or more.
If I could follow up on that, right? I guess maybe the second challenge that I've personally experienced is then leveraging that data, right? So I think that a lot of times customers almost look at the tech and the data as that's the end result, and we're going to save, X amount of dollars
Right,
based on
Mhm.
deploying this tool. But I think it's very difficult, again, in my opinion, to instill the culture of, now that we have the data, what can we actually derive from it? What can we actually do with it? What can we, tangibly change to improve production? So maybe, like, are you seeing
right.
something of that nature, and how do you guys maybe navigate that?
So what I'm seeing in that nature, so let's take those non-critical assets as a tank farm, a remote tank farm, which we don't have everything wired up,
Mhm.
but we want to use IoT. So today you might have on every shift, so every 8-hour shift, you might have an operator go on some frequency to go look at measurements and do all that and make sure everything is fine, and then come back and input that data in somewhere.
Mhm.
But then if you look at the US labor statistics and see that for every open job, there's less than one person available to take it, forget whether or not they're
Mhm.
qualified. So there's a huge gap in workforce at these plants. So I don't think anyone is looking to cut heads. This is my opinion. But I believe that what they're trying to do is augment the people that are there so that they can actually do the job in the most efficient way possible and still be a successful business. So that's what I'm seeing that people are heading towards.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? The example that I will use is, I've seen FDA plants not collect data that they're, liable for five
Yes,
years
yes,
for
Yes.
batches and such. And as you mentioned, there was a very similar process where someone needs to go and collect almost, on paper, obviously,
Mhm.
like, the temperatures and sort of the cooking of a batch. But a
yes,
lot of times that would be missed, and whether or not they
Mhm.
could process those reports, a few years down the road, would be a question
yeah,
mark. So I think that's a very good example for sure. Okay.
Absolutely. And I would say to Jane's example of a tank farm, I've done some work with like I guess they're technically a small refinery, right? They're 3 to 500 tanks of varying types of crude in and different types of oils and gases and diesels on the outside. And they had an issue of not just was someone supposed to go and walk it. So for them, I think it was like once every 24 hours, but
yeah,
there would very regularly be days or weeks of that information just completely missing, and we didn't know how much of any particular well, really anything in the tank farm we had at any point in time. And something like, I don't know, once a month or once a quarter they'd run into an issue where, hey, we've got way too much diesel, or we've got way too much one of these other oils, and they had to literally go slash their prices in order for their end users to go take it, so that because they had literally run out of tanks in order to go fill. And
right,
because it happened so regularly, they had literally taught their customers to never buy diesel up until the point that they're selling it like 30 cents on the dollar, because everyone knew once a quarter, if not more often, they would just completely overfill themselves in diesel
right,
tanks, because and they didn't know, which was the biggest issue. So I had suggested a similar IIoT solution to what Jane had talked about. We didn't have the best reception as to, hey, we could fairly easily go solve this problem and you could have real time updates of the tanks. But I think that's a fantastic example. So tank farms, things that are non critical. I've done lots of like oil, or I've done lots of wells
yeah,
that are hundreds of yards, if not further, away from or sometimes miles away from kind of the nearest building, and you're never going to go run power, much less power and Ethernet out there. And so some
right,
sort of wireless device or wireless cellular device. I love the batteries that now last 5 years, which means you can change them every 3 years and still feel very confident.
right,
Or the little solar panels. I think that, especially in tough environments, has come an extremely long way. I do want to go
yeah.
talk about kind of the problems that you had talked about with connectivity, and I think Jane, your comments were kind of the lack of standards have caused problems with people leveraging IIoT.
So when I look at so for a customer with Aperio, they were explaining this is our environment physically, process control network, IoT, and the cloud and everything that they were doing, and they listed all the different types of sensors that they had. And I was like, oh, well, that's cool. So I decided that I like to dig in really deep and dive in deep. And I looked up every single one of those vendors and every single one of those products and how exactly does it work and how do you install it? How do you collect the data? What kind of lifetime does it have? All the pros and cons and everything. And what I realized was that they're all different. They're all great, they're cheap, but if you have a dozen different sensor types, that means you have a dozen different hubs, data hubs, and a dozen different things you have to interface with, put a connector in order to get that data into your cloud or wherever you're going to store your data. And that makes it harder to adopt, and it makes it also it's not really comparable to DCS systems where if
Mhm.
you bought one particular DCS back in the 80s that you're stuck with that vendor for every time they go obsolete, spending millions and upgrading. It's not quite that expensive, but you do get stuck with certain vendors because you've already bought so much, and things should be more interchangeable, and the communication method should be more interchangeable, and it just should be easier for the end user, and then you can adopt. So if you have some sort of open standards, that's the best way to increase adoption.
Jane, like to that point, I've debated a lot with, I guess, people that create such platforms, and I think they always try to protect, I want to say, the synthesized
Yes,
information, right? So I
yes.
understand. Let's say if you let's take like something simple as an example, like vibration sensors on motors. I think they usually make available, let's say, just the raw data, but they will
Yes.
protect, let's say, let's call it the secret sauce, which is how do you figure out there's an anomaly with the motor or the pump or what have
Mhm.
you, and then it becomes, the conversations at least I've had with customers is that they want the data, but I'm not even sure that they're able to process it or they have the capability to, ingest that raw data and make any good decisions on
Mhm.
their own. I don't know if Aperio solves that problem, but I would assume.
So I'm actually trying to hold off until the appropriate time to start pitching Imperio, but
Sure.
the it's very interesting with that problem, and sorry, I've got too many thoughts going on in my head for a second. When we're looking at all the different data and all the different type, and you have this proprietary information, right? So there's some of them even that, like the battery health, the battery life is proprietary. You don't get that information unless you pull it from their hub. What I'm seeing a lot of customers doing is just using the IoT for the information, for the raw data,
Mhm.
pulling it through the hub because they have to, because it's proprietary, and then putting
Mhm.
it into their own analytics and their own data. So these
Mhm.
customers that I'm working with, where they're trying to form that source of truth or have one source of truth, they're pulling that raw data through. And the one example I'm thinking of where they also calculate the battery health, which is also proprietary, they're pulling that information through, and they're doing their own analytics off of that information. Now, what Aperio can do is if you have, say, you have tank farm, X group, all these tags, IoT tags, you can at Aperio in bulk look at the health of the entire area from a sensor standpoint. Do I have good data coming from all of these sensors? So we can recognize if the signal strength has gone down, or if you have a flat line, or it's out of range, operating out of normal range, and things like that, and in bulk. And that's where that advantage comes in. Otherwise, what our customers are seeing is they have to do all of this manually. So yes, they could have a dozen different data hubs that they have to have someone look at every day, or set it up to send alerts into your maintenance system or something, but it's a
Mhm.
lot of steps. And humans, just like your tank farm example, Dave, losing a quarter of data or something, someone writes it down and has to enter the data in. Problems happen, papers get lost, that's life. And so the idea of getting the data is more reliable when you use sensors like that. But you have to actually look at that information. So just installing it's not enough. You have to take it to the point where you get insights. And that's where it becomes even more complicated because there's too many systems to maintain. And so the one customer that I'm thinking of, they're moving it all into ADX, and they're doing all their analytics there. And they're using Aperio to monitor, do I have a data quality issue? Meaning, is there something wrong with just the raw data coming in before I use it in analytics? And that's how it's being handled.
And that's super interesting, right? I guess for those who are listening that have not maybe experienced sort of the questions of data quality or data challenges, I can tell you, having worked again in food and bev, that as soon as there's an issue with your data, right, and people see maybe the wrong information or a lack of information,
Mhm.
like you mentioned, because a sensor has flatlined or something's not communicating properly for whatever reason, people lose trust very quickly, right? So
Mhm.
the moment that solution does not give them information that they can point to the field and say like, hey, I'm seeing this in the field and it's not what I'm seeing inside of my platform, whatever that may be, right? It could be
Right.
historian, mes, erp. They will very quickly distrust anything else that that platform provides. So it's interesting that it's automatic. I've
Yes.
done a lot of those checks manually, so I can certainly
Yeah.
appreciate the work it takes
And
to.
when you talk about trusting the information, so throughout my career, working with safety systems and safety applications, you would put two or three transmitters on a very critical thing, like a pressure of
Mhm.
a reactor or something like that. So you have one transmitter, and the operator kind of believes it. You have two transmitters, and they're slightly different, and they start getting upset. And then you put that third transmitter in, which gives yet another number, and they don't believe any of it, and they've totally given up. Which one do I trust? And so I think it's human nature that if the data that they're seeing doesn't match their gut because they have 20 years experience on that board, then
Mhm.
they're not going to trust it. So whatever we can do to build that trust, to educate and bring awareness and verify. If someone doesn't trust it, well, okay, go look at that tank level. What does that look like? How does that compare? And do that verification.
Let me, I guess,
Abso
ask you to expand on that, Jane, a little bit, if I may, because I think again the cultural, how to say it, like aspects of like data collection and educating people on how to properly maybe use these systems are extremely important. At least, like again, like in my experience. So maybe, what are your thoughts on once the data is in place, once we're collecting some of that information, how do you educate the teams? Again, do you train maybe the plant manager to then help him train all the way down to the operator, or do you help the operators understand maybe some of the new value they can extract
Yeah.
from the system? So I'm curious on that side of things.
So for me, and this goes back to when I got to be an operator, it all comes down to starting at the source, the person
Mhm.
closest to the process. So one thing that I learned from that first summer job was that to never trust the drawing, go out and verify everything before you update it, before you use it. So I learned, so for 35 years, I always verified my drawings, and I took that to the data. I always verified my data and all that kind of thing. And as I started building control schemes, I would sit and work with the operators. At Covestro, when we started implementing our new platform, we had ideas and we put together a structure. And I said, okay, we're going to do it the way I've always done it, which is to go sit in the control room with the operator and the end users and get their feedback. And if it takes weeks, it takes weeks. It doesn't matter. You sit there and you listen to them. And what I found is that when you actually properly engage the end
Mhm.
user and you listen to them and you take their ideas, then they add to the project and they become part owner. So say in
Mhm.
this tank farm, there's also loading on it and they've got weigh scales for the trucks and stuff like that. Well, we may have censored all of the levels or maybe even the pump vibrations and things like that, on, off, whatever. But did anyone consider that weigh scale? Who's taking care of it? And the operator will say, well, what about the weigh scale? How come you
Mhm.
don't have a sensor there? So we add a sensor onto the weigh scale. We added
Mhm.
into the data collection and responding to the data and things like that. And the operator gets excited. Hey, you actually implemented my idea, and then they become the evangelist within their
Mhm.
team, and everyone starts using it. So
Dave?
that's always been my approach, was go to the bottom. It's a bottoms up approach. The plant manager, they use the information, they talk about it, and I have to admit that when I was plant manager, I experimented. When something came top down, uh, if I ignored it because it was just a corporate effort and we didn't do anything, nobody noticed. And then because the next initiative was coming and then the next initiative. But if you
Mhm.
actually want to make real change, you have to engage those people who are actually doing the work and making sure, hey, does this make sense? Do you have any feedback? Is there something I'm
Mhm.
missing? And by doing that, it makes a big difference.
I'm not sure I've ever agreed with someone so much as I do with Jane in her previous comments. I was thinking to myself, we'll have to make a note, and we should make this like required listening for junior engineers and or like junior project managers
There you
who want to know how to go and I don't know successfully talk to people to go solve problems. But no, Jane, I think that's absolutely correct. That 100% aligns with my experiences as well. I do want to talk about Aperio, but there's one question that I feel like we need to answer before we go talk about your current position is who is buying IIoT and who cares about IIoT, right? I imagine to some extent the operators that we just talked about, they care as long as it connects with everything they're seeing.
right.
I've certainly seen lots of executives who want the information and the visualization as to if they use it. I don't know. So in your experience, who really cares about IIoT? Who's buying it? Who's using it?
So what I'm seeing is that you have the engineering group. So we're working
Mhm,
with a few Fortune 500 companies, really large groups, global, and it's the very technical people. So you might have a director of technology for IoT or a data owner, a time series data owner. I've actually met someone
mhm.
with that title, an
I love
IoT
that title.
owner, and that sort of thing. And these are people who have worked their way from being an engineer and up into making decisions and to fixing problems and all that. And they're like, there's this huge, market out there, this technology that can make our lives easier because we can't
Mhm,
afford to wire up every single asset, every single
mhm,
thing, everything that happens. And that's where I'm seeing it's kind of like that middle manager area that who came up from actually working in the field or working in engineering and solving problems and when you start getting too high, or if the top leadership is more business related, not
mhm,
coming from the plants, then they don't quite understand what's missing. But then if you ask them about their smart home, and does your Nest thermostat automatically change your temperature when you're away? Does your refrigerator tell you when to get milk? That kind of thing. Then they start to say, oh yeah, stuff that I wouldn't have wanted an alert on is actually quite convenient. And so everyone's got a, if they don't have camera system, they might have a ring on their front door. And
mhm.
so it's yeah, that's one way you can reach people who haven't actually worked in the field.
I'll make the comment, Jane. I'm sometimes surprised how little it bothers people that at home you have all these great smart devices, and then you go to work and you have a lot of stack of papers and those like old charts where it's marked down on
Yes.
using like ink. So look, again, I've had many of those like discussions with customers, but that's I think as you mentioned earlier, manufacturing just moves a little bit slow.
Just a little bit slower. And I have to confess, I do not have a smart home. I deliberately don't have a smart home. I bought an old house and remodeled it. And my brother was the GM and he was wanting to make it smart. And I'm like, no, just pull all the wires out of the wall. I don't want it. I even have a fake doorbell. So no one will bother me, right? It's like if
Love
I don't
that.
know you're coming, I'm not going to answer the door. So you can stand out there and push the button all you want. I'm not going to hear it. So yeah.
Dave?
I appreciate that because I also don't have a smart home and like vehemently against that. I feel like
Yeah.
that's my life the rest of the time. I do not need an app for quite literally anything. I do not want my refrigerator to tell me that I need to order. I would honestly be freaked out if my refrigerator started telling me I needed to order more things. Vlad, similar to screens, probably makes up for enough home automation for the rest of us, though. So between the three of us, we are probably about even on the home automation side.
I would say I'm somewhere in the middle. So certain things are very good, right? But then there's certain
Mhm,
things that are a bit more concerning because as we discussed a little bit, and this is I think less so on the manufacturing side, but more so
mhm,
with consumer electronics. Almost everything goes through the cloud, and there's almost
mhm.
no way to
Yes,
access it directly. So you need to be, I think, smart in the way you design your home automation. And I will say
Yeah,
that in a general sense, the companies in the B2C space, the life
yeah,
cycle is just much faster than,
yes,
in manufacturing. Exactly. So the control systems that you see behind me could be running for 30 years, but
yeah.
some of the home automation stuff, it's 2 years and the chips are now being replaced. So, anyways, that's a whole other tangent that we don't have to get into, but there's just differences. So some stuff I like, some stuff I'm a bit more hesitant on. That's my take.
yes.
Absolutely. And I would say on the consumer side there, I feel like anytime you go look at something, within 6 months, there's some sort of terrible, catastrophic security breach or cybersecurity breach, especially on cameras. As I was following cameras for a period of time on the consumer electronics, consumer IoT space, there were lots of serious breaches that I saw, which makes me even more untrusting than I normally
Yes,
am for things like that.
yes, agreed.
Moving us maybe to, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on the data side, right? And I think Dave asked the question of maybe who are the champions and maybe the
Mhm,
buyers, but who are the stakeholders when it comes to using data, right? So I think we've talked about operators being maybe the primary beneficiaries, but a lot of times, I would get into a facility and they're looking to get data for, let's say, like weekly reports or like daily OE reports, and it could be anywhere from, let's say, a maintenance manager, engineering manager, to the leadership. So I'm curious, maybe how do you see different groups approach data, and maybe what kind of, in a general sense, data are they looking for, right? Because again, I don't think the plant manager needs sensor level detailed data, but he wants to know if his facility as a whole is working correctly. So maybe just to expand on that a little bit.
So there's definitely a wide variety of people who need the data and respond to the data, and they all have different roles. And when you look at everything from the process engineer, which I'm very familiar with that role, operations and maintenance, and now we have data scientists that are looking at all the data, but also business analysts. So let's take an easy use case. Let's say safety and environmental reporting, say permit reporting. And that person who's responsible for those quarterly reports or how often they go out doesn't care that much about what's happening in the field. He wants to make sure when he runs his report that he's got data on it and the data is correct. And the only time he knows to raise his hand, and I use he loosely, it's they, that whenever I say he, think they. So whenever they raise their hand, it's only because they look at a number and it's like, oh well, that looks like 10 times what it was last quarter, so maybe I should ask somebody about it. But they don't have a feel for how that whole thing works, and so they're interested in, am I going to report the right information to the environmental authorities on a regular basis? Is the annual report for the company going to be correct because all the data that went into it has been verified and we understand exactly the performance of the plants and everything that's happening, and so they don't actually are involved in the plant or what's happening, and they're getting data on the IT side. It's already been aggregated and sorted and cleaned everything for them, and so they're looking at it from that view only. And you might have the data scientist who, now it used to be, all these chemical engineers, PhD chemical engineers, and they would have dynamic simulators. So first principle dynamic simulators that they looked at everything. Now you have data scientists who are software developers and who understand data, just looking at cause and effect relationships and writing software to give them the information that they need based on the data that they're seeing. So it's purely data driven, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what they see in the plant. And so it's really interesting perspectives. And so you're not these different users may not know what the health of the data looks like because they're so far removed from it. Now, in operations and maintenance, I've already talked about the operator, but the maintenance group, they might have predictive maintenance, and that requires good data going into it. But they also have routine scheduled maintenance and inspection that they do, and they follow that along, and they often find problems with the data as they're going through and doing their calibration on the instruments and checking the vibration on a manual, walkthrough and things like that. And they'll recognize sooner if there's actually a problem in the field because they're closer to it. But what they care about is really just the maintenance issues, not the operational issues. So they're not looking at the data saying, "Hey, has my current value changed that much?" They're just looking at it from is the transmitter performing in the proper band as what it's set up for, or is it top or bottom of the scale, or is there an error code? So the perspective is different. And then, of course, the IT and OT system administrators, OT, I always had the MES down and ignored IT for a long time, which I now regret. But the OT, administrators, they're looking at the whole plant connectivity. Do I have data coming from the transmitter through the control system, through all the marshalling panels, through the interfaces, through the PI system, through everything? Is all of that working like it's supposed to? And they're not worried about whether the data is right. They're worried about data connectivity and do they have data. And then the IT administrator is even further away because once you push that to the cloud, then it's their problem. And they're just expecting the data to be right going into it. So when I look at trying to sell to customers, I want that operations and maintenance level who are leaders in the space, but who actually understand what's happening in the field and understand when they don't have the right data, what does that mean to me?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's extremely important, right? I think you've mentioned groups that are far removed, and I think the key holders who are the maintenance and engineering folks usually need to facilitate the integration that then allows this sort of like data pipeline into other groups. I think that definitely makes sense, and they can also facilitate the data to flow back in a synthesized way back to the operators that again maybe sometimes need the granularity of what the
Right,
sensor is showing, but ultimately they still need to make decisions with the process. So they need some
right.
level of synthesis of information. Let me ask you about challenges, right? So I think we talked a little bit about systems being maybe on different like protocols or requiring like different hubs, but from a let's say if someone's sold on the idea that they need more data or they would like to collect more data today than they did, a couple of years ago, what are some of the challenges that you would see them encountering through that exercise where they could be maybe stumbled easily or maybe require some extra help or like guidance on a certain platform or from like a systems integrator for example.
So the challenge is what I always think of first is someone's got to pay for it. Are they looking at the right location? And I think there are so say you have a unit engineer and general unit engineer, whatever their education is in, supporting a process unit, and they want to implement new technology. They might not think of all the different ways that things that they need to monitor and actually how to do it. So that how, I mentioned earlier that I regret ignoring IT. I realize now working for Curio that I thought I was technical, but I am not near what these folks are in the R&D team as far as technology goes. And there's so much I don't know, and so it, there's a lot of things you can do at home, right? You can play with it, and you can figure it out. But when you start looking at a big scale in a manufacturing facility, it's actually quite difficult. Where do you install your interfaces? Does it need to be in a weatherproof container? Does there need to be a nitrogen perch on it? Are we going to have interference to the cellular network, or to the LoRaWAN, or to Wi-Fi? Is it HART protocol? I mean, the whole thing. What is the best technical solution, and how do I get it done efficiently? That really, the how to do it, I think, is the hard part. once you got someone paying for it and they get it, good data, you need data to make decisions. It's really
Mhm.
how is I think the biggest challenge. And how do we do it in an efficient way so you actually get value and a return on your investment the same year?
How do you, I guess, like maybe doubling down on that challenge, how do you recommend companies approach that, right? So is it maybe taking a step back and figuring out the entire architecture that you can deploy in a scalable way? Or is it, running maybe some kind of an R&D project on a smaller part of like a plant or maybe a department before figuring out, well, like maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and scale this a bit differently? Like, how would you approach that? Because I think both are could be valid, but
Right. I mean, my approach is always, what problem are you trying to solve? Don't say, "Oh, I'm going to install IoT," without actually knowing what problem you're going to solve. And because having the latest tech does not actually bring magic, like there's a lot of hype that's out there, and so you want to be sure that so if you have a customer, for example, and your customer could be, this field engineer, right, this unit engineer, what do they want to know? What are they missing? What are they trying to solve? If the customer says, "Well, I would need to know how much fluid is going from tank A to tank B for mixing or whatever, and I can't get the $1 million I need in order to wire everything up and put on a control system, all that kind of stuff." Well, why do you need that? So you just dig further, and then you end up building the business value through the conversation of what problem are you trying to solve. And, so they may start with, well, I need IoT. Well, why? What are you trying to solve? Do you really need IoT? Is that the best solution? And you talk through the whole thing and to make them understand, oh, well, I really need to know this is a custody transfer meter, and I need to make sure that I know the humidity around it. I know if there's any rain on it. I need to know if someone touched it and it's in the wrong position, so it's actually moved and it's no longer functioning. I mean, could be anything.
yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. There is a question in chat. I know Dave was gonna bring that in. That is, I think, well tied to technologies and the hype in the current industry. So, Dave, do you want to pull that in?
Absolutely. So Khalil is asking, what about AI? And I want to answer that as part of what you're doing with Aperio, Jane.
Okay.
So I know we've bounced around it a little bit, but tell everyone a little bit more about what Aperio is, who you guys are as a team, and how this technology is interesting enough to get you out of your semi-retirement, and go commit a bunch of time to. Tell us more about that, please.
So, what Aperio does is that does use machine learning. So it does use one of the forms of AI, and it measures the data and it looks at all the different ways that the data stream changes. So time series data, pressure, flow, temperature, whatever. And there's like I mentioned, really smart R&D engineers, and there's engines for all the different things that could happen to data. So you could have a flat line. You could go out of your normal operating range. You could have something that it starts skipping. You have some sort of chaotic signal that's skipping
Mhm.
around doing things. You could suddenly get a change in how many samples are coming in, either go from one a minute to one every half second or to one every 10 days. And all those things, um, when you have a million points, or say in my first operating unit, I actually counted, I had 1,000 transmitters approximately and 100 control loops. That was one unit, right? How do you watch the whole unit in one instant and understand how is everything performing? There's all kinds of stuff you can build and do and things like that. With Aperio, you can create a grouping, a scope of work says, okay, I'm going to monitor this unit's performance, say those 100 control loops, valves included, whatever. And I want to look just at a glance, how do I look at the performance of my data? And we've made that possible. So all 100 control loops, transmitters plus valves, all 1,000 transmitters. You can look at them in one place, and you can understand with the score, so data quality index score, DQI, is my DQI 50%, meaning that it's junk? Or is it 85% and maybe I've got an interface down? Or maybe there's flatlining in one area, because the interface is down, or there's a signal problem and the transmitter is holding last value, or the PI system or control system is. So those kind of things you can look at quickly. And the way I see it is that we are eliminating a lot of the busy work of trying to figure out where are my problems. Because today, an operator gets an alarm. If that alarm is important to him, and it's he didn't think it's right because everything else looks fine. It's just one point in alarm state. He calls the maintenance guy and says, "Hey, go look at this. It doesn't look right." But only if it's important to him. If it's not important to them, then they just turn it off and they ignore it. Well, it could actually mean something to somebody. It could be one of these environmental critical tags that, no, it's not important to you. You're running the process and doing your job, but it's important to somebody. And that somebody doesn't notice it until it's time to do the reporting, and they realize that value's been flatlining since the last report. And so, those kind of things is we help identify very quickly. And that actually segues, Dave, into what you asked, why did I go to Apereo? Because I had a few conversations with customers that were using it, and I got to witness it firsthand. Where, oh, hey, we're get on this customer call. It's an hour-long call, and they open up DataWise and they look at the tree map, and they're like, "Wait a minute, this doesn't look right." And we're like, "Oh no, something's wrong with their software. What's wrong?" And the person said, "Well, these are the wrong names of the interfaces," and they had been in the middle of a data aggregation project, and they were pulling, they have all these on-prem Pi servers, and they're pulling a bunch of stuff up to another layer, and they were connecting Apereo to this other layer, and they realized that it's a manual process, and they misnamed some stuff, and they weren't collecting the data into the place where they wanted to collect it because they had made some errors. And she ended the call. She's like, "Well, I need to get on this, and so we'll talk next week." And they corrected the problem, and it was like that moment. I thought, when I was at Covestro, Cindy, the head of global head of Pi, she was wanting an easy way to monitor the entire global OT network. Well, you can now with Apereo. So yes, every Pi machine, you can do Pi alerts. You can have it tell you stuff. You can have it send you emails. Or you could look at all your heartbeat tags around the world on your OT network in one place. Hey, are any of my IP addresses not pinging properly? Is there a problem there? And so the second example, on a call, and the person was a fairly new user. They'd been playing with it for a while, but this is a new user. And he was telling me, he's like, "Well, I'm interested in these. All I care about is these environmental critical tags. I don't care about anything else." And so he loaded his tag list, and that's all you need is a CSV file of your tag names. And we go to that group, and he looks at it. He's like, "Oh my God, I've got a flat line." And he put in a maintenance request. They went and looked at it. Yes, it was holding last value. It was configured that way, or calibrated that way, and then they fixed it. And he goes, "You know what a hassle that would have been when we have to turn in the report in 24 hours, and that's when we find it." So now every week he opens up his little grouping of his scope for environmental critical tags, and does anything have an event on it, and can I look at that? So a few of those examples where they're like, "Oh, that got me excited." And so that was when I said, "Okay, I'll join." And I'm really glad that I have. I mean, I do miss my afternoon naps, I have to admit. But I really enjoy talking with customers and people who work in the field and the problems they're having, and hey, how can we help you solve the problem?
I would
Absolutely.
say, go ahead, Dave. Go
I,
ahead.
I I was just going to make the comment. I can't tell you how many times I've seen what would have been a critically important and useful environmental tag or other tags such as that in a troubleshooting process that you go back and look at it and it's been just flatlined for most of the time it's like 12 months, right? Like most of the
Right,
time it's been out for a year, and you can guesstimate like outside temperatures and maybe extrapolate that to inside temperatures, but it would have been critical for some other process, be it environmental
right,
regulations or most of the time troubleshooting because something catastrophic happened. And so we're here
right,
trying to go do a post-mortem, and this would have been really helpful data if we had it, but we
right,
don't have it. So
right.
I feel that pain. I can't tell you how many times I feel that pain, but I absolutely feel that pain. Vlad, what are your thoughts?
I was gonna make, I guess, a similar point to what you said, Dave. I think that companies have a lot more blind spots, even on when the, let's say, like sensors fail, because the way systems are programmed. And I'll give like a simple example. You have a, let's say, like a high limit of, if it's above, let's say, 70C, then raise an alarm. But a lot of times, let's say
Mhm.
that sensor, the cable gets cut off and it's just sitting at zero. Obviously, that alarm is never going to trigger, and so until something catastrophic happens, nobody
Yep.
truly knows that data point is no longer present, right? And
That's
I've been through programs where, again, those alarms were just again programmed in a way that would not capture any of that information, right?
That's right. I mean, if you look at doing the alarm rationalization for your
Hmm.
unit, production unit, and you have to justify every single alarm that the operator has to deal with, and the best in class is 6 alarms per operator per hour. Well, if
Yeah.
you really want an alarm on everything that's on there, then you end up with 120 alarms per operator per hour. And I know from experience that what they do when that happens is they go to the volume button and they turn it down, they only care about what's on their screen in front of them, and they just
Mhm.
ignore all the alarms. So
Yeah.
a lot of the alarms have been removed because it
Mhm.
doesn't add value, and there needs to be a way now. How do we look at the health of those transmitters without waiting for our annual inspection
Mhm.
or whatever that is? And there is a way through the level 1 transmitters and getting that health information and actually seeing that. But again, that's a reactive response. You have to go and you have to do it. You might even be able to pull it up, but it's still a one at a time transmitter or into the system to see that data.
Is there so there's another question from the same gentleman of how do you ensure the scalability of IoT solutions as industrial operations grow, right? And maybe to ask on the device side, is there a way currently to map, let's say, if you have an industrial network with a lot of devices, is there a way to automatically sort of like instrument the data coming out of those devices, or do you still need to go maybe more manually, like figure out what the IP is, the data is, because again, we've talked about different protocols, different hubs, different locations. And are you seeing us converging to maybe that
I'm not
reality,
see
which
I'm not yeah, I'm not seeing that convergence yet, but I would love to see it to where it actually makes it easier and more out of the box. I'm sure if you're buying an asset now, buying a heat exchanger, plate drum heat exchanger or something like that, you can get it with IoT devices that come with it. But then you still have to understand, well, how do I get that raw data and how do I use something with it? I'm sure that heat exchanger vendor will also sell a data hub for you, so to you, in order to use that. But I see that that is still a big gap, and that we're not seeing the conversions as quickly as I would like because it's there, but it's difficult to separate all the hype out with the reality because it still requires work. There's still effort. There's definitely reward, but you have to sort
Mhm.
through all the hype.
yeah, and I would say, I think if anything, that problem is going to balloon because we're going to have more and more devices communicating data back, and I see this with different machine vendors already, right? Whereas a machine from 30 years ago would maybe have a couple of hundred sensors, and most of them would just be internal to the machine. Versus now, it could be thousands, right? It's every single like pressure sensor is now
Yes.
sending data. So to your point, there's more alarms, there's more sensors, more devices, and so I think finding a way to scale that would be interesting, but I'm not sure we're there either.
From a device perspective, I'm not sure, where that's going. It'd be great if everything was standardized and it would automatically connect to whatever hub you have, as long as it followed the standard protocol, as you installed it, and then send it wherever it was you wanted your data to go. I don't think we're there yet. Maybe after this, podcast, you'll get a couple of entrepreneurs that say, "Hey, we should start that and do that."
That's a
Oh no, Jane.
dangerous.
No, no,
Yeah.
no, Vlad, please, please, Vlad, cover your ears. Forget the last 60 seconds. Um, famous, dangerous last words. Now, Vlad's not going to sleep for the next 12 hours as he goes to name this new organization that we've just created live on the show. But remember, Vlad, you can't do it until you deliver the peanut butter that you promised like 30 episodes ago.
Yes.
I don't know about this peanut butter, so you're gonna have to give me the episode so I can listen to it.
Maps, we'll have to figure out the episode. At one point, we were talking about something which reminded Vlad of a peanut butter factory he worked in, and we said something to the effect of, "What if we just make mass customizable peanut butters?" And what were you gonna add? You're gonna add chocolate and honey? Is that what I remember, Vlad?
Well, I mean, the most delicious peanut butter is the one with the most sugar, right? So you can pretty much add any ingredients. So maximize on chocolate, maximize on honey. It's great.
That's amazing, Jane. This is super interesting. I'm super excited to watch Aperio as you continue to help the company grow and come back with even better stories. Because I feel like I felt the pain on every single one of those that you were talking about, and if Vlad and I are feeling the pain, I would imagine most of the customers you're talking to are as well. We do want to ask you the final questions that we ask all of our guests. And as I told you, the first one is perhaps my most fun because it's the most difficult. But we want to ask you to predict the future, be it of IIoT or of data. What do you think that the future of that looks like for our industry in the next 3 to 5 years?
I mean, it's there's all kinds of sci-fi shows that we could refer to, and it's really hard to imagine because the last 30 years happened before I realized it, right? You know, we
Mhm.
went from computer control, heavy computer control, now everything is IoT and Industry 4.0. And, you know, I imagine that at some point in the future, we'll have this standardized approach to collecting data. And of course, everyone's privacy will be protected or nobody will care anymore and they'll sign off on it. And we can always know what's happening at whatever location we're interested in.
Mhm.
And see that the concern I have is, you know, who's going to be out doing the farming and who's going to actually be doing the manufacturing and who's going to be doing the work and making sure that humanity can survive while we're all enjoying the benefits of technology.
That is terrifying, but I completely agree with it. Is at some point that is why I say manufacturing jobs will continue if we can go
Absolutely.
fill them. Is because at some point someone has to make things, and I'm not sure we're ever going to have enough cool robots to go fill the farming fields. Despite the fact that they've got some wild and interesting contraptions that
Yes,
continue to come out that I'm happy to watch on a screen and stay far away from.
I agree.
Um,
Yes.
Jane, you had some really interesting career advice for kind of early to mid stage folks. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what one of your top pieces of career advice would be, please?
So, one of the things that when I changed from Sterling Chemicals to Bayer MaterialScience Covestro, and
Mhm.
they were trying to talk me into taking a leadership position, I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And so they sent me to a class, and it was a mid-level leadership development program. And I went through the class, and I like learning, so I
Mhm.
leaned in, paid attention, and get something out of it. And they came back at the end, and the follow-up evaluation was that I was one of the best negotiators that had come through the class. And I was like, really? And I started looking back at my career. And to be honest, I was the only woman out there doing this, or one of the only
Mhm.
women. At Sterling Chemicals, we had maybe 8 at the most technical women in the field, a couple of engineers, someone sending working with me and in the system side, and a couple others, but it was mostly men. And when you have
Mhm.
a 20-something-year-old woman going into the control room and all these 50-year-old men, I'm like, hey, I'm going to download your control system. Are you ready for an update on your reactor controls? And they're going to freak out, right? So I had to be very patient and slow and explain and work with them and integrate myself with them, and that helped me learn how to read people's body language. I could tell if someone was getting irritated, if they were getting mad, if they didn't want me to talk to them, if they were having a bad day or whatever. And I would adjust my message, not the point I was trying to make, but how I was delivering it in order to match, so they would actually listen to me. And I ended up working with some great people, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, Jane, we'll let you try it. We trust you." And I was told once that if you never shut a unit down, then you probably weren't working. So I was definitely working. I have a few examples of that. But it was really about leaning in and integrating. So I left that leadership class. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to practice. So I decided to take the opposite of every argument that there was out there, just to see, can I improve on that? And I learned, the important thing is that I learned that I like to solve technical problems, but people are problems too, and you have to learn how to reach them. And there's problems to be solved that are people focused, and that's even more interesting because you cannot predict. You maybe can predict some because you know the person, but you really can't predict what's going to happen because you don't know what all has happened to them that day or that week or things like that. So then I was like, yes, okay, I'm gonna do this. And I made myself as visible as possible. So I have a lot of mentees, and they're around the world. And I say the first thing you do is you always sit at the table. And this is more than just an expression, because the conference rooms have a table. And so you sit at the table and you kind of lean in like you're really listening. And every single meeting that you want your name to be thought of or your face to be thought of, that on a topic, speak up. It doesn't matter if you have something to contribute or not. You ask a question, you make a clarifying statement, you add something to it. Oh, hey, that's really interesting. I'm curious about XYZ, whatever. And then over time, over months or longer, people start to associate you with that topic. They get used to seeing you there. They get used to listening to you. They hear your voice and oh, this is Jane. She's the control expert. Let's listen to what she has to say. And that one thing right there has changed a lot of people's lives. By don't wait to be invited, but actually invite yourself. And so then I used to also watch the dynamics in a meeting, and if nobody was taking charge of the meeting, I had things to do. So I'd say, okay, well, what's the topic here? Let's move on. Let's write it down, and that. So if you see a space that's not being occupied that needs work, then you step into it and you make it happen. And then I also, one last tip is using the whiteboard for arguments, because you change the energy from the people to the whiteboard, and you get everyone to add to the whiteboard, and they're all in agreement. They just didn't know. And so it's fun stuff like that. But it's all about human dynamics.
Vlad, we might have to retire the question after this because I'm not sure we're ever going to get a better answer than Jane just gave us. Jane, that was awesome. Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
That we will have to go and clip that out. That in and of itself, again, just like everything has been fantastic. I would like to just touch on the mentorship part, because I know that you said that you have lots of mentees.
Yes.
Again, coming into an organization, especially large organizations, generally do a good job pairing people with mentors, mostly in like actual programs. But if you are coming into a new organization and you are looking to excel, or you are young and are looking to learn more, going and finding someone who is either an official or an unofficial mentor within that organization, absolutely always a good suggestion. They'll be able to both help you navigate internally, politically, as well as help with your career. And to Jane's point of shutting down a reactor, Jane, I'm not sure I trust a single 20-year-old person who's like, I've come to push a controls update on your reactor. I was thinking to myself, and I'm like, we could send it over to Vlad, and Vlad could look at it. And if Vlad gives us the thumbs up, or perhaps Jane at this point gives us the thumbs up, then I would feel good. Short of that, I'm not sure I'd feel good of anyone coming to go try to push a controls update on a reactor.
So on the that's great. On the mentorship, even though if the company does have programs, I would recommend that everyone look for their own. So you want to look. You can do peer mentorship, which is always nice, but you want to look 1 or 2 levels above where you're at. someone you trust and respect, and then make an appointment with them and ask them, hey, I'd really like to learn from you. I'm interested in XYZ that you're doing. Will you be my mentor? And that you'd be surprised that most people will say yes. And it's really enlightening and fulfilling to have that. And every year or two, I would change mentors and start all over again. So I've had both men and women mentors,
Interesting.
Americans and German.
Let me ask you
Interesting.
if I can follow up maybe from the, because I think the question or the hesitance I get from mentees especially is what can they bring to that relationship, right? So having maybe being a mentor now for a lot of people, what are your thoughts on what does the mentee can what can they bring to you to make that relationship a bit less one-sided per se?
Well, the way I look at it and what I get out of it is that each individual person has their own unique perspective. And so every mentee mentor relationship I have, I view it as a peer mentoring. So many will start out mentoring, but then they'll talk about something. I'll think of a story to give them advice, and that leads into a whole conversation. And I'll end up getting advice back on handling something. And so it's really quite interesting. So even if you're new and don't know anything and don't feel like you're contributing, you actually are. And then also people like to talk about themselves and what they're good at and what they do, and they like to help people, and it makes them feel good to do that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Absolutely, Jane. That has been fantastic. We always like to ask our guests for book recommendations. You've got a bunch of book recommendations, and you're actually writing a book. So first, can you tell us about the book you're writing, and then if you also have a book recommendation, that would be awesome.
So I am writing a book on the evolution of industrial data with
Mhm.
how with a colleague of mine, Leif Erikson. Leif and I never worked together, but we know each other in the industry, and it's all about using data in manufacturing. How did it start? How did we get to time series data, and how does all that work? And as a reference, I looked at a book called How Data Happened by Chris Wiggins and Matthew Jones, which was really interesting. But it's has not that barely touches on manufacturing and industrial data.
Yes.
I was like, well, we got a great gap here. I mean, they're talking about a lot of interesting topics in there, and it's all
Mhm.
relevant. But I'm really interested in time series data, and how did
Mhm.
that come about, and how can we make the most use of it? How can we get more, better, faster, so that our lives are easier and that we benefit from that? So that's one impactful book. And then being head of customer success, I'm actually reading about the 7 pillars of customer success and trying to learn, make sure I understand the lingo and the right things to do, and that we don't get too distracted. But most of my reading is in the fiction realm, and I read for pleasure as a way to
Mhm.
disconnect from stress, and it's mostly horror and fiction, so mysteries, things like that.
Absolutely. No, that is exciting. I am interested. Please let us know when the book comes out. I'm interested to go ahead and take a read through that. I would absolutely agree. I feel like we have so many decades of industrial knowledge, and for a large part of it, up until I don't know 5 to 10 years ago, it was you either read a 10,000 page white paper,
Right,
or you pull it from another engineer, and once those engineers all retire, it's just the information is gone and evaporated. So
right.
I'm excited to hear your telling and recounting of living through much of that to go bring us to where we are today, which
Yes,
from computer-based DCSs to ML and AI.
yeah.
It will be a very interesting read. So thank you for
I hope
that,
so.
Jane.
Thank you.
And last question for you is how can our listeners help? Who should reach out? Who are you looking to connect? Who might want to go visit Aperio? What sort of customers are you guys looking for there?
Really, any customers, if you have time series data, we can help you solve your problems, and you can reach out on our website. There's an inquiry page. You can reach out to me directly through LinkedIn or my email address. It's just jane@aperio.ai, and yeah, anyone who wants to talk about data or talk about industrial problems, I love the conversation. So I'd like to continue that. And I'm also, open for mentorship if someone would like to discuss that with me.
Jane, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I am already looking forward to when we can get you back on to continue this conversation, because this is absolutely one of those conversations that could have gone 17 hours. So thank you so much for this. Everyone, thank you for joining us for Manufacturing Hub. Again, we're talking about IIoT all month long. If you already aren't following Jane or Aperio, you guys will go ahead. The links will be there. If you are on LinkedIn, they will all be connected into the event like normal. If you guys are looking at listening in podcast form, they'll be in the show notes. If you're not following Vlad, myself, and the Manufacturing Hub, please feel free to go ahead and do that. Join us next week, Wednesday, same time, same place on the internet as you guys normally find us at 4 o'clock East Coast time. And if you've made it this far on podcast format, please do all of those normal things that we ask, like and subscribe and rate us 5 stars. Jane, when I remember to ask and we remember to post on Thursdays, our normal time, we have more people who listen. That the number just keeps rising,
Right.
which is awesome.
Well, it's been great talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you, everyone else. Until next time.